Lecture 5, Unsettling the Hierarchy Within the Person Body in Daoism. The pictures are on the right, are on the top. My favorite rendering of Zhuangzi, Dreaming the Butterfly by Ike no Taiga. And at the bottom here is a cover of a children's book by Alvin Trescent, illustrated by Roger Duvoisin. And it is based on the story of the frog and the well. It's a bit different from the telling in the Zhuangzi, but very much in the Zhuangian spirit, as I shall discuss later on. Confucian and Daoist approaches to the social and natural worlds are not just competing, but deeply complementary. Each responds to grave flaws in the other. In this lecture, I want to explain why I think the Daoist texts Daodejing and Zhuangzi, with more attention to the latter, respond to arguable flaws in Confucianism. I begin with a characteristic criticism of Confucians to be found in the Daoist texts, which is that the project of achieving virtue tends to degenerate into a striving for superiority over others that not only perverts the aim of self-cultivation, but defeats the equally important aim of helping others to improve. I do not think that by itself, this is a decisive criticism of the Confucians, but investigating the basis of that criticism will lead, I argue, to a useful critique of Confucian ideas of governance, both within the individual and in state and society. Virtue and superiority over others. The fourth Rianzhen Shi, or In the Human World chapter of the Zhuangzi, comments on the Confucian project of trying to correct the course of rulers. It does so by constructing dialogues between Confucius and Yan Hui. Yan Hui desires to go to the ruler of Wei, who is heedless of the lives of his people and piles up their corpses throughout his land. Yan Hui wishes to take what he has learned from Confucius and derive standards and principles to apply to the situation. Though Confucius expresses skepticism about the prospects of success for his student, he does give him advice if he insists on going on. To quote from Ziporin's translation, "Do you know what it is that undermines real virtuosity? And for what purpose? On the contrary, cleverness, Ji, comes forth? Virtuosity is undermined by getting a name for it. Cleverness comes forth from conflict. For a good name is most essentially a way for people to one-up each other, and cleverness is most essentially a weapon for winning a fight." De, translated above as virtuosity by Ziporin, is the power to respond efficaciously to circumstances at hand. But Yan Hui's efficacy, Confucius implies, is hampered by his desire for a good name. And here, Ji, which might be taken as the kind of knowledge based on conscious deliberative understanding, is an instrument for manipulating people, and hence with cleverness or wisdom in scare quotes. Confucius's advice to Yan Hui includes perceptive observations about the counterproductive effects of moral lectures that are motivated by the desire to one-up others. The motive is likely to be detected by the intended audience, and if the audience is also amoral and powerful, can be dangerous to the attempting one-upper. This kind of Ji is not anything genuine, but simply a tool for lording it over others. It is a kind of knowledge Socrates would accuse the sophists of having. It is a kind of knowledge that some of Socrates' detractors would accuse him of having. When Ren and Yi and Ji become tools for the assertion of one's superiority over others, they are far from being genuine. Chapter 19 in the Wang Bi order of the Daodejing expresses this theme by associating the elimination of sageliness and throwing away of knowledge with benefiting the people 100-fold. the elimination of Ren and throwing away of Yi with the return of filial piety and compassion. The denigration of these Confucian ideals is completed with the association of eliminating craftiness and throwing away profit with the absence of robbers and thieves. Moreover, even if Yanhui's virtuosity were, quote, ample, reliable, and firm, and unmotivated by the desire for a good name, he will, in the eyes of others, simply be showing off his own beauty at the expense of the ruler's ugliness, unless he connects with the vital energies of others and with their minds, or heart minds. Yanhui presents an array of strategies for dealing with the ruler, but Confucius dismisses them all, saying, "You are still taking your mind as your instructor." To cease making his mind his instructor, Confucius tells Yanhui he must fast, jai his mind. When Yanhui asks what this fasting is, Confucius talks of single-mindedly focusing the will, listening with the mind rather than the ears. Further, it is listening with, quote, the vital energies and not just the mind, unquote. Where the ears are halted at what they hear, the mind is halted at whatever verifies its preconceptions. But the vital energy is an emptiness, awaiting for the presence of beings. Yanhui then describes his experiences of such fasting. Yanhui said, "Before I find what moves me into activity, it is myself that is full and real. But as soon as I find what moves me, it turns out that myself has never begun to exist." There's much philosophy that underlies the critique of the Confucian project. The first thing is the rejection of the Confucian hierarchy within the person. It is implied that the source of all the clever preconceived plans that Yanhui is fruitlessly proposing to Confucius is the heart mind and its conscious deliberative awareness. As indicated earlier, Confucius first cast some suspicion on Yanhui's underlying motives. He ostensibly is out to correct the young ruler's course and the lives of the ruler's people. But is he perhaps out to make a name for himself? One cannot help but recall Analects 5:26 in this regard, where Confucius asks Zilu and Yanhui what each of them would most like to do. Zilu's answer is most revealing of who he is, loyal and generous to the core. "I would like to share my horses and carriages, my clothing and furs with my friends, and if they damage them, to bear them no ill will." Yanhui's answer is oddly reflexive. "I would like to refrain from bragging about my own abilities and to not exaggerate my own accomplishments." But he has some reason for his concern, given the high praise he has received from Confucius. There is no hint in the Analects that Yanhui went around bragging or exaggerating, but it would be a very human temptation for someone in his position and with his capabilities, and the Zhuangzi is perhaps picking up on just that. Perhaps Yanhui's expressed aspiration reveals awareness of a potential weakness of his, and vigilance may be the best safeguard against it. This leads me to the second point, that regardless of Yanhui's real motivation, the ruler will take it to be the less worthy one. He may not be unreasonable to do so either, given the way that most people probably around him behave. And we must not underestimate the effect of expectations in making prophecies fulfill themselves. The idea that Yanhui's attempt to convert the ruler is liable to put him into an angry defensive stance resonates with the point made in the previous lecture that direct attempts to get someone to change their mind about a fraught matter are liable to provoke counter-reaction. Instead, Confucius goes on to suggest Yanhui must connect with the ruler on a level other than that of conscious deliberation or cleverness. That takes us into Confucius' advice for him to fast his heart-mind, resulting in his self not yet having begun to exist, so that he may be able to interconnect with the ruler's vital energies and heart-mind. That seems to resonate with the finding in contemporary psychology that curiosity about how someone has arrived at their viewpoint is a much better entree into getting that person to change. I'll have more to say about this later, but to understand more of what lies behind the advice of the Zhuangzi's Confucius, we must consider passages from the notoriously difficult second chapter of the text, the Qi Wu Lun, or equalizing assessments of things, where there is another mention of loss of self or forgetting the self. Constructive skepticism. Though skepticism appears in many places of the text, it receives the most sustained, varied, and intricate expression in the second equalizing assessment of things chapter. One intriguing and extremely challenging feature of the skepticism expressed there is that it seems intended to dent our confidence in our knowing anything of importance, but also involves substantive claims about the nature of the world, about the self, about language, and its relation to its users and the world. The opening reflection by Ziqi is a case in point. He declares he has lost himself. Wu Sanghua says that he hears the piping lie of humanity, but not yet the piping of the earth, has heard the piping of the earth, but not yet the piping of heaven. The piping is conveyed through the image of the great clod, the Da Kuai, blowing its breath, its qi, through the 10,000 hollows. The wind through the hollows, when light, brings a small harmony, and when powerful, a grand harmony. In blowing through each of the 10,000 hollows, the piping of heaven allows each to go its own way. In contrast, the piping of humanity is characterized in combative terms. It is like arrows from a bowstring when we presume to pronounce on what is shi fei, right and wrong, correct and incorrect, fitting and unfitting. This activity is simultaneously constricting and life intervening for the combatants themselves, who are, quote, held fast as if bound by cords, continuing along the same ruts. The mind is left on the verge of death, and nothing can restore its vitality. The piping of humanity is presented as in discord with the piping of the earth and heaven. Joy and anger, sorrow and happiness, plans and regrets, transformations and stagnations, unguarded abandonment and deliberate prostrating. Music flowing out of hollows, mushrooms of billowing steam. Day and night they alternate before us, but no one knows whence they sprout. That is enough. That is enough. Is it from all of this presented ceaselessly, day and night, that we come to exist? Without that, there would be no me, to be sure. But then again, without me, there would be nothing selected out from it all. Zhuangzi goes on to suggest that there must be some controller or true lord behind all these goings on, but it shows no form. If we follow whatever has so far taken shape, fully formed in our heart minds, making that our teacher, who could ever be without a teacher? The heart mind comes to be what it is by taking possession of whatever it selects out of the process of alternation. But does that mean it has to truly understand that process? The fool takes something up from it too. But to claim that there are any such things as right and wrong before they come to be fully formed in someone's heart mind in this way, that's like saying you left for you today and arrived there yesterday. As the passage indicates, the heart mind comes to be what it is, acquires an identity through selecting qi from the process of alternation. This heart mind is changxin, a fully formed or completed heart mind, and with it comes a right and wrong through a process that one may not truly understand. This suggests that the piping of human beings is formed on the basis of selecting from some of the piping of heaven and earth. Our very conceptions of right and wrong are products of this process of selection. Something is affirmative because someone affirms it. Something is negative because someone negates it. Courses, that is, Dao's guiding discourses, are formed, Cheng, by someone walking them. Things so by being called so. Whence thus and so, from thus and so being affirmed of them. Whence not thus and so, from thus and so being negated of them. Now, what are we to make of the claim that things are so by being called so? There is no implication that the world itself is a product of our selections, but rather, as I read this passage, that the very oppositions between right and wrong, and thus and so, and not thus and so, only emerge within the subjective worlds we have fashioned from our selections, from our conceptualizations of things with certain identity conditions that differentiate them from other things and from their environment. Compare the view in the Chi Wu Lun passage with a view articulated by contemporary philosophers such as Nelson Goodman and my late colleague, Iris Einhauser. On this view, facts such as what things are in the world and the properties they possess are not there independently of how we conceptualize them. We carve out facts from the stream of goings-on in our environment. An independent world is responsible for this stream, and we systematize and structure it using only a very small portion of what we could glean from that stream to systematize and structure a view of that world to make sense of and navigate through that world. That we must filter out most of what we receive through our senses is necessitated by the limitations of our cognitive equipment. Recent neuroscientific studies suggest that the mechanism for filtering out consists in suppressing conscious awareness of information that seems irrelevant to what we are currently focusing on in the environment. An ancient region of the brain that we share with fish, the basal ganglia, plays a key role in suppressing sensory signals before they reach the region of the brain, performing the complex cognitive functions of planning, prediction, and conscious control of behavior, the prefrontal cortex. This is how we can hear other people at our table in a noisy restaurant. But the necessity for selectivity is also a reason why our conceptualizations of the world end up being quite partial in the sensory information that we make sense of, and why there are always alternative conceptualizations that make sense of information we are currently suppressing. The world independent of us does constrain the range of viable conceptualizations. Here I call your attention to the picture of the constellation, either the Big Dipper or Ursa Major, and the alternates have point metaphors for this process of selection that creates things and facts about them include sculpting a statue out of marble or naming a particular constellation, such as the Big Dipper or Ursa Major, through discerning a certain pattern of stars in the sky. The process of selection cannot produce just any range of facts, just as one cannot make any pattern given the location of stars in the sky. The constraints come from the nature of the input from the world, the features of our sensory and cognitive apparatus, and the nature of the interaction between the two. It is just that the constraints do not determine a single correct systematization. You may see the Big Dipper, I may say Ursa Major, depending on, as it were, how we connect the star dots and how many star dots we include in our picture of the constellation. Notice, however, that this characterization of how we select things and facts presupposes certain claims. For example, that our conceptualizations do not simply try to capture pre-existing facts, but in fact, partially constitute them. Moreover, the characterization of human piping is set within a framework that asserts the overall unity and harmony of heaven and earth that is constituted by the great clod blowing its breath through the 10,000 hollows. Constructive skepticism and substantial assertion about the world and how we relate to it do not just sit side by side in this haunting imagery, but are intertwined. Thus, not only is constructive skepticism compatible with the view about conceptualization going into facts of the world, but also more substantive claims about the nature of the world as a whole, consisting in interdependent, fluidly interacting things that are never permanent, but flow into and become each other. Their emergence from and return to a greater whole is a unity, though the nature of that unity remains mysterious. Indeed, the complexity and fluid plasticity of things is part of what makes the range of alternative conceptualizations of the world significant and wide. The significance of the content of this way of all being one, in some sense, is that it carries with it the expectation that it will be elusive. To be sure, some passages in the Equalizing Assessments of Things chapter seem to be skeptical in a more ordinary way by calling our attention to the human inability to resolve arguments. Suppose you and I get into a debate, it said at one point, and if I win and you lose, does that really mean that I'm right and you're wrong? Of course, we must answer in the negative, and that is why in the course of exploring the possibilities for determining who is right and who is wrong, the possibility of bringing a third party onto the scene is raised. But whatever that person's view turns out to be, agreeing with me, agreeing with you, agreeing or disagreeing with both of us, we may still question how this person can straighten us out. For in the end, all that other can do is to put into play another point of view, the superiority of which remains to be established through instruments that are splendidly fitted for persuasion, but not necessarily what is really right. Moreover, the variation in meanings of words often results in our talking past each other, as is the case with the Daoists and the Confucians. Each affirms what the other negates and negates what the other affirms, the Zhuangzi says. Though speech is not just the blowing of air because it has meanings, these meanings are peculiarly unsettled. The Daoists and Confucians may be talking past each other because the meanings of the words they use are not uniform between them, even though there is enough overlap in meaning so that they take one another to be affirming, sheing what the other is negating, feiing. Their selections from the alternation do not coincide enough for a resolution of their debate. The reference to the Confucians and Daoists ends with, quote, "But if you want to affirm what they negate and negate what they affirm, nothing compares with using the light, Yi-Ming." Though the standoff between the Confucians and Daoists could have the relatively simple skeptical point that each side's positions rest on fundamental views for which they can give no reason compelling the other side's assent, it also fits well with the deeper point that our conceptualizations profoundly shape how we see the world and understand its input. When different sides have alternative conceptualizations and when they are all within the range of how the world constrains us, then they will indeed end up with different meanings or standards for applying crucial terms such as shifei. Daoists, for example, will see the human world and what's important to human beings in terms of benefit and harm, li hai. While Confucians will recognize among the fundamental human goods the comity of deference and yielding achieved through ritual, li ran. We have good reasons to call into question our claims to knowledge, but these reasons are themselves based on a view of the world and of our tenuous grasp of it. If we believe these reasons, we may well refrain from saying that we know that our view of the world and our relationship to it is correct. Still, it is possible to hold such a view of the world, to recognize its vulnerability to doubt, to pose on its basic reasons to doubt specific knowledge, and to offer on its basis ways to discover more of what there is in the world. To begin to see how, let us turn to the notion of using the light. The reference to yiming is sometimes taken to be an assertion that there is a way of knowing that is not subject to skeptical doubt. This way may be a kind of knowing how, different in kind from propositional knowledge, or it may be a kind of mystical, ineffable insight into the nature of things or their oneness. The skepticism on this interpretation is limited to skepticism about words, argument, and discursive theory. This interpretation accords with the passages that focus on the difficulty we have with words and argument, as in the passage about the shifting meaning of words and the futility of arguments between the Confucians and Daoists, or ones we try to resolve by bringing on more participants. Such passages, however, do not explicitly limit skepticism to words, arguments, and theories. On my reading of the Zhuangzi, views affirming the possibility of unmediated access to the way things are cannot be ruled out and may at times be seriously entertained. There is no singular authorial voice that provides the authoritative view in the Zhuangzi, but rather different views that are in dialectical conversation with each other. Here I pursue an interpretation that stays with the inevitability of mediated access to the world. Using the light involves recognition of the way we contribute to the construction of the worlds we live in, and how this contribution provides plenty of reason to doubt the completeness and/or accuracy of what we think we know. But also is this recognition that can prompt us to reconceptualize, to reselect from the alternation so as to attain new insight. Consider perception as a mode of access to the world, which is featured in the opening story of the first Xiao Yao You, or Free and Easy Wandering chapter, in which the huge fish Kun turns into an enormous bird, Peng. When Peng launches himself 90,000 miles up into the sky, we are asked whether the blue on the blue of the sky is its true color, or whether it is simply the distance that makes it look that way. After all, when Peng looks down, he sees only this and nothing more. We, looking around on Earth, see much more than Peng does from high in the sky. So perhaps Peng's skyward haunts are similarly populated with things we cannot see from down here on Earth. The story goes on to detail that Peng's size makes it necessary for him to put a great deal of air underneath his wings in order to bear him up. On the other hand, considerably smaller creatures, such as the cicada and fledgling dove, struggle to make it from the sandalwood to the elm tree, and they scoff at the idea that Peng could go 90,000 miles up in the sky. These three creatures illustrate that their size and powers to navigate their environment determine their Umwelten, the worlds of their perceptions, and in which they act as subjects. An organism selects from the alternation, given its size, powers, and needs, and this selection determines the character of its world. Some of the latest scientific work on the nature of perception indicates that it is not a passive reception of a sensory given, not a reception of a direct message from the world, which we then proceed to conceptualize and make inferences from and theorize about, but rather partly constituted by what we expect to see. More specifically, perception turns out to involve educated guesses as to what's out there in the world, impinging on us. What we see is in great part shaped by what we expect to see, given our past experiences and what we have been taught. As philosopher of mind Andy Clark observes, part of what makes this process tricky is that a single pattern of sensory simulation, he says, will be consistent with many different sets of worldly causes, distinguished only by their relative and context-dependent probability of occurrence. According to this theory, or rather theory, since there are many specific models that fall under the general ideas, we predict what is causing the sensory stimulation we are getting. But over the course of perception, continuously adjusting these predictions according to the match or lack of it with sensory stimulation in the next moment. On Clark's apt image, perception is a matter of surfing the waves of sensory stimulation, in the sense that we are making continual adjustments to the waves as we encounter them. For example, the initial sensory stimulation we receive at the outset of a perceptual experience may lead us to expect that we are seeing a human face. And based on that expectation, we make predictions as to what further stimulation we get in the next moment, which prompt us to turn our gaze towards certain regions of the visual field. We may then get confirmation through reception of sensory stimulation, suggesting, say, the shape of a nose. But if we do not, we may have to come up with alternative hypotheses as to what we are seeing and make new predictions, which in turn prompt us to search the visual field in different locations. This picture of the two-way processing from the bottom and from the top also suggests a major source of human error. When we become too invested in our predictions, our processing of sensory stimulation may lead us to ignore some disconfirming parts of the signal and to amplify confirming parts. Susanna Siegel gives the example of Jill's believing without justification that Jack is angry at her. When he sees Jack, her expectations make him look angry to her. Her top-down processing leads her to ignore some parts of the signals from Jack as mere noise and to amplify others. Moreover, this leads her to scan Jack's face, gestures, and bodily postures for more signs of anger. She ends up finding evidence for her expectation. Action and perception, as Clark puts it, are, quote, locked into mutually misleading cycle, unquote. Perhaps it will be objected that Siegel's case involves too much of a theory-laced element of interpretation of another's emotions, so much theory-laced so as to fail to be persuasive, persuasive example of how perception may err based on expectations, acting as a filter of sensory stimulation. However, the view of perception we are coming to recently is that it's very much theory-laced, even if much of the theory we marshal in perceiving the world is non-consciously applied. Further, there are well-known experiments indicating how much top-down processing can influence perceptions we normally assume to be very bottom-up. For example, if we are shown a rotating face mask, we know that one side of the mask is the outside, convex shape of a person's face, while the other is the inside, hollow or concave shape made to fit onto a real person's face. However, as the mask rotates from a view of its outside convex face to the inside concave face shape, and if the lighting conditions eliminate shadows, we only fleetingly hold on to the perception of the concave inside mask. The perception irresistibly flips into that convex face shape. We end up seeing only the hollow side for a split section. And let me illustrate this by this website, the rotating face mask. As you can see, these are face masks. There's a hollow side, but as the hollow side rotates, our perception turns it into a three-dimensional face going in the right directions. How does this happen? Information from the three-dimensional world comes into our two-dimensional retina, and we have to reconstruct the world based on the signals together with our expectations. There are no shadows on the concave side to give us strong cues as to the shape of what's in front of us. Moreover, the face is so significant for human beings that we have special neural equipment to read it. Our strong expectations as to what faces look like overrides the awareness that one side of the mask is concave or hollow. We have the perceptual experience of a convex face shape. Now, consider that we are now coming to a new kind of theory as to what memory is, not as a video and audio recorder of events in the past, but as hypotheses or reconstructions of what happened given fragmentary memory traces. Combined with a picture of perception as surfing waves of sensory stimulation through prediction based on some part of our prior conceptions of the world, we get a picture of ourselves as living our whole lives within our constructed worlds, our own Umwelten. Of course, our subjective worlds are formed through interaction with the independently existing world that is common to us human beings. Human Umwelten tend to share common features because of the similar construction of our sensory apparatus, similar needs that lead us to explore the environment in similar ways, and similar powers of navigating that environment. A striking passage in the Equalizing Assessment of Things chapter seems to connect the variability in the Umwelten of various animals with the idea that different animals fit their environment in different ways because of the differences between their sizes, needs, and powers to engage with it. When people sleep in a damp place, they wake up deathly ill and sore about the waist. But what about eels? If people live in trees, they tremble with fear and worry. But what about monkeys? Of these three, which knows what is the right place to live? People eat the flesh of their livestock, deer eat grass, snakes eat centipedes, hawks and eagles eat mice. Of these four, which knows the right thing to eat? Monkeys take she-monkeys for mates, bucks mount does, male fish frolic with female fish, while humans regard Mao Chang and Lady Li as great beauties. But when fish see them and they dart into the depths, when birds see them, they soar into the skies, when deer see them, they bolt away without looking back. Which of these four knows what is rightly alluring? From where I see it, the transitions of humanity and responsibility and the trails of right and wrong are hopelessly tangled and confused. How could I know how to distinguish which is right among them? Note that if the point of these observations about various animals is a fairly simple relativism to the effect that each picks out the features of the environment that is most relevant to their size, needs, and powers, there need be no skeptical thrust. People, deer, snakes, hogs, and eagles eat different things because they are different creatures. But this difference in what is right for each of them need not pose problems for the prospects of gaining knowledge. Yet the passage ends with a declaration that the trails of right and wrong are hopelessly tangled and confused. This conclusion would make sense if the point instead is that different animals are inevitably partial in selecting the features of the environment that are the most suitable given their size, needs, and powers. The Umwelt of an animal is likely to leave out features of the world that are not so relevant to its needs, and maybe some features are out of reach entirely from the creature's powers of understanding and perception. It is also highly significant that right before the quoted part above, Wang Ni is asked if he knows that he does not know. The answer is, how could I know that? This indicates that the sort of skepticism at play is not dogmatic skepticism that forecloses or deems futile the activity of attempted discovery. In fact, there are indications that the sort of constructive skepticism advocated in the text can aid in discovery. In the Free and Easy Wandering chapter, Huizi planted the seed of a great gourd, and it grew to be over 100 pounds. Filling it with liquid, he found it not firm enough to lift. Cutting it in half, he found it too large to scoop into anything. Concluding that it was useless, Huizi smashed it to pieces. Zhuangzi scolded his friend for not knowing how to use the gourd, asking why he had never thought of making it into a vessel to float through the lakes and rivers with. That Huizi could only think of using the gourd to scoop into things meant that he still had a lot of tangled weeds clogging up his mind. What prevents Huizi from seeing how he could use the gourd is his preconception of how gourds can be used. He has already deemed and affirmed the use of the gourd to scoop, and when the gourd does not accord with his preconception, he deems it incorrect or wrong and smashes it to pieces. Our so-called knowledge of the uses of things can rigidify and keep us from looking further into how we might relate to them, especially when a new situation makes the received uses irrelevant. This skeptical stance is constructive in two ways. First, the prospect of overturning received ideas is greeted not with anxiety, but with delight. The nearest contemporary analog to the sort of healthy and constructive skepticism I see in this text is to be found in science. For example, some scientists express disappointment in the news that experimental studies in the Large Hadron Collider had confirmed the existence of the Higgs boson particle, which in turn provided further confirmation of the standard model of particle physics. It has been 35 years since the appearance of a new particle had surprised the field, Stephen Wolfram, in 2012, remarked in a tone of sadness. He expressed desire for a discovery that needed to be reckoned with and required further exploration. His wish now may be in the process of becoming fulfilled. The standard model is not apparently in accord with 2021 measurements of the muon G2 particle. And when these results were confirmed, there was much clapping and jumping up and down by physicists. Recall that Zhuangzi chastises his friend for not clearing his mind of the underbrush of fixed conceptions of how the gourds are to be used, implying that the underbrush can be cleared, at least some of it. More generally, the implication is that we can become aware of how our entrenched concepts and names for things can be limiting and as a result strive to broaden our current perspectives. We can do this by learning something from the perspectives of others, in this case, Zhuangzi himself. We can learn from non-human others as well, as we observe how their perceptual fields differ from our own and from each other's. This is the point of the subsequent commentary from the cicada and the fledgling dove on the soaring flight of the huge bird named Peng. These little creatures laugh at Peng, saying, "We scurry up into the air, leaping from the elm to the sandalwood tree, and when we don't make it, we just plummet to the ground. What's all this about ascending 90,000 miles and heading south?" In comparing the perspectives of different animals, we can recognize that each has its own Umwelten, and we realize this applies to ourselves. We are like the cicada and fledgling dove in measuring what is possible or sensible on the basis of our own limited experience. Quote, "And he whose understanding is sufficient to fill some one post whose deeds meet the needs of some one village, or whose virtuosity pleases some one ruler, thus winning him a country to preside over, sees himself in just the same way." Here, the gourd story prefigures the theme from the Equalizing Assessments of Things chapter that those who engage in qing and qifeng are held fast as if bound by cords and continue along the same ruts. When we encounter things that render inadequate our entrenched preconceptions of how to put them to use, we lose the flexibility of response necessary to stay alive. Losing oneself. The outer Chu Shui, or Autumn Floods chapter, contains characters who have not learned that what they know is far less than what they do not know. They take their Umwelten to constitute the whole world, and characteristically, their worlds are selected to highlight their own importance and preeminence. The needs of a creature that go into the selection and construction of its Umwelten are not just biological or physical, but psychological. Such is the case with the frog in the sunken well. Not only is he happy cavorting in his well, jumping about on the railings and beams and splashing in the water and treading in the mud, but the surrounding crabs and tadpoles are no match for him. For him, it is perfection to have mastery over a whole puddle of water. Now, in the telling of Zhuangzi, when the frog invites the tortoise of the Eastern Ocean into his abode, the tortoise cannot even get in without getting stuck. He tells the frog of the ocean's vastness, even in used time of the great floods. Its waters never rose, that in times of the droughts, its shores did not recede. Hearing of this, the frog was astonished and utterly discouraged. So in Zhuangzi's telling, the frog exemplifies the human need to see ourselves as masters of the world, a need satisfied through selectively constructing our own little worlds. To use the light, then, we may have to lose the self that needs to loom so large in our sunken well worlds. It is significant that the passage that puts forward using the light as a way of transcending the futile arguments of philosophers and others who insist on their way of seeing the world begins with Ziqi saying, "I have lost me." We are able to use light only when we have lost the self that constricts the world. I might comment here that in Alvin Tressel's telling of the frog in the well, it's a considerably sunnier version. There's no tortoise coming into the well to bring the frog disillusionment with his own world, but rather the frog is forced to go out of the well to seek bugs to eat, and he discovers a whole new world there. And different creatures that each has its own world, he discovers, different from his own. And he decides, even when he has the opportunity to go back to the well, to stay out in the bigger, broader world. You might say that he has used the light to stay out there. Thus, one of the biggest causes of the tangled weeds that clog up the mind, to go back to the image Zhuangzi applies to Huizi's failure to find a use for the gourds, is the self. Those inclined towards a reading of the Zhuangzi as advocating the idea of unmediated access to reality will read this passage as pointing to just such access once the self has disappeared. As noted earlier, I do not rule out this reading as one of the voices contending in the text. Insofar as we read the text along the lines of constructive skepticism, however, it is open to any claim to knowledge and will dismiss dogmatic skepticism, declaring that nothing important can be known. Accordingly, it may be dogmatic to dismiss the possibility of unmediated access to the world. However, the stance of constructive skepticism is that nothing is immune to vigorous interrogation either, including and perhaps especially any claim to infallibility about an unmediated access to what is in the world. Consider that in the Equalizing Assessments chapter, Zhuangzi says, "How then do I know that in delighting in life is not a delusion? That delighting in life is not a delusion. How do I know that in hating death, I am not like an orphan who has left home in youth and no longer knows the way back?" And later, while dreaming, you do not know it's a dream. You might even interpret a dream in your dream, and then you wake up and realize it was all a dream. Perhaps a great awakening would reveal all of this to be a vast dream. Unmediated access to the world, that is, may be a dream or a dream within a dream. Then, what would be the point of losing the self if not to gain transparent access to the world? As quoted earlier, the mind comes to be what it is by taking possession of whatever it selects from the process of alternation. We locate ourselves within the Untitled we have constructed, and seeing the world anew means deconstructing that Untitled, or at least significant parts of it. I do not think, on the way I read Zhuangzi, that we ever erase all conceptualization of the world. But if we are nudged to subtract and reconceptualize it, we may glimpse new aspects we have not seen before. This is another sense in which I think the skepticism of this text is of the constructive kind. Yet we are never to rest easy or content with what we have discovered, or rather should be ready for the next overturning of our Umdaten. The less we are wedded to our sunken wells and our pride of place in them, the more ready we may be to glimpse the vast ocean beyond. This idea receives much confirmation in contemporary cognitive and social psychology. Joachim Kruger has characterized the ego as like a totalitarian government, shaping its perception in such a way that it protects a sense of its own goodwill, its central place in the social world, and its control over relevant outcomes. A study based on cardiac operations and interviews of surgical teams found that teams that worked effectively together were led by surgeons who were approachable and inviting of others to contribute, while the ones that did not work together effectively were more autocratic in style and especially struggled when they felt their authority was being threatened. In another study, the leaders of teams charged with decision-making tasks were induced to feel powerful. Such leaders were found to dominate discussion, and as a consequence, missed learning critical information that their teams had. The hazards of taking one's changxin, one's completed and already formed mind, as the undisputed leader of the person body, suggests an alternative to the hierarchical model of leadership within the person body. To return to the passage about Yan Hui and Confucius, with which I began this lecture, Yan Hui must fast his heart-mind to quiet his ego, to make himself forget about himself, gets in the way of seeing what must be done. Going by the rightness of the present this. Sometimes what must be done can sound pretty conventional. At a later point in the Human World chapter, Zhigao is appointed envoy to Qi, and he becomes apprehensive. If he fails, he will get into trouble with other people. If he succeeds, he will trouble the internal balance between his yin and yang. Confucius' advice is to accept the two great constraints of this world. Quote, being a son or a subordinate, there will inevitably be times you cannot avoid having to do. Absorb yourself in the realities of the task at hand to the point of forgetting your own existence. Then you will have no leisure to delight in life or abhor death. That would make this mission of yours quite doable. There's no indication here that Confucius' advice is being denigrated or presented in a not mocking tone. But the conventional course of action here is right only because it is right at the present moment. There's no shortage of passages in which playing this loyal subordinate is neither inevitable nor desirable. There is a story in the outer Chu Shui Autumn Floods chapter in which Zhuangzi dismisses emissaries from the king of Chu who ask him to take control of all the king's realm. He would prefer, he says, to be a live turtle dragging his backside through the mud than a sacred turtle dead for 3,000 years and kept in a bamboo chest by the king. In the Autumn Floods chapter, not coincidentally, it is proposed to make rightness one's master and eliminate wrongness, and to make only order our master and eliminate chaos. Ruo of the Northern Sea replies that that would be like taking heaven as one's master, but not earth, or yin along as one's master and eliminating yang. The rulers of the three dynasties sometimes yielded their thrones to others, and sometimes passed them on to their sons. The ones who acted on these policies at the wrong time got called usurpers, and the ones who did it at the right times were called righteous. The implication is that no uniform rule, such as yielding or passing on, can be relied upon. Ruo of the Northern Sea replies, quote, do not restrict your will, but expansively limp and stagger along with the course, the Tao. bit later he adds, do not unify your conduct, but be uneven and varied along with the course. A given instance of passing on the throne to others or to one's sons was right or fitting to that moment, but human beings mistakenly infer a uniformity to the rightness that goes beyond that moment. Reliance on our conceptualizations, our selections from the alternation, when they have overrun the occasions on which they are apt, does not enable us to travel the uneven and varied Tao. From the perspective of our orderly conceptualizations, we are limping and staggering along in an unprincipled, eclectic fashion, first accepting loyalty to one's ruler as our fate and then choosing the mud. Consider this related passage from the Equalizing Assessment of Things chapter. It is all just a matter of going by the rightness of the present this. You'd be doing this without knowing it, and not because you have defined it as right, is called the course, the Tao. If we become aware of how our conceptualizations form a scheme of shifes and that there are endless alternative schemes that interface with our common world, we may be receptive to entering, or at least partially, into the Umwelten of others and to be able to work with them. Confucius applies a scheme to the situation in which an envoy's anxieties need to be soothed. The scheme in which accepting political responsibility is like consenting to be put into a bamboo box, is what works for Zhuangzi when the emissaries of the king call upon him. In dealing with others, we go along with them and enter their Umwelten. The monkey trainer in the Equalizing Assessment Things chapter enrages the monkeys by offering them 3 chestnuts in the morning and 4 in the evening, but delights them when he offers them 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening. It is all the same to the keeper, but a world of difference to the monkeys. The trainer did not just go by the rightness of his own present this, but the rightness of their present this. In effect, Confucius is advising Yan Hui to go by the rightness of that ruler's this, apart from all his preconceived ideas as how to improve people, and only then can he have a chance to change the ruler. To do this, he must damp down his personal investment in succeeding by fastening his heart-mind. Indeed, he must cease making the heart-mind his instructor and listen with his qi, or vital energies. And fasting, which might be a kind of quiet sitting or meditation, is what helps. Then he might be prepared to go along with the ruler. With this, you can play in his cage without impinging on his concern for a good name. When he's receptive, do their crowing, but when he's not, let it rest. Do your crowing. When he's receptive, do your crowing, but when he's not, let it rest. Do not let him get to you, but do not harm him either. In particular, sitting meditation may prepare the heart-mind so as to be more receptive to signals that are ignored or given lesser weight because they do not correspond to our expectations, ones we might be inclined to dismiss as noise. If predictions based on expectations tend to act as filters, then we tend to see what we expect, and we use that to confirm the model that is both generating our expectations and sculpting or filtering both our observations and our estimates of their reliability. Recognizing the partiality of one's conceptualizations, that one's wrong may be another's right, being receptive to and ready to act on the other's present this is what I think the text is getting at in the Equalizing Assessment of Things chapter. When this axis finds its place in the center, it responds to all the endless things it confronts, thwarted by none, for it has an endless supply of rights and endless supplies of wrongs. Thus, I say, nothing compares to the illumination of the obvious. The approach to changing someone described in the Confucius-Yan Hui conversation resonates with a therapeutic technique in contemporary psychology called motivational interviewing. It was developed for treating substance abuse problems, but also used to help voters to reconsider their prejudices, divorcing parents to reach settlements, and resistance to getting vaccinations. Instead of trying to make change happen in people, one listens carefully, asks open-ended questions so that they might find within themselves their own desire to change. If one attacks the feasibility of their present goals, one might very well run into hardened defensive stance. On the other hand, if one were to ask them with genuine curiosity how they intend to carry out their goals, they might begin to realize the difficulties and become open to their own ambivalence. To help others to be open to change, one must be prepared to change oneself. So far, I have related Zhuangzi's focus on listening to the qi and heart-mind of others with one's own qi and one's heart-mind that has been cleared as much as possible of one's preconceptions and plans, and also of one's intentions to steer change in others in accordance to those conceptions and plans, preconceptions and plans. Rather, one seeks simply to connect with the qi and heart minds of others to detect what is there that might serve as a basis for our further joint action. There's another sense in which one's qi cannot simply be regarded as follower of the heart mind. To talk about that sense, I must bring in another metaphor employed in the Zhuangzi, the mirror. To be a mirror is to take in and to reflect more of what there is in the world, to not let our prior commitments obscure what doesn't fit with them. To understand what this metaphor conveys in the Zhuangzi, one needs to distinguish what would be like a mirror in this sense from a crude and literal conception of what it is to be a mirror. The latter conception presupposes it is possible to transparently depict the way things are. Transparency on this conception is equivalent to passivity. Activity is equivalent to distortion. However, as the Ying Di Wang Sovereign Responses for Ruling Powers passage about mirrors says, the consummate person uses his heart-mind like a mirror, rejecting nothing, welcoming nothing, responding, but not storing. Thus, he can handle all things without harm. In the relevant sense of being a mirror, one responds to things without storing. A responsiveness that is handling things is an achievement, a skillful activity. And this is why the skill stories in the Zhuangzi are relevant to understanding what it is truly like to be a mirror in the Zhuangzi sense. We have here a picture of an ox inspired by the Cook-Ding passage in the Zhuangzi. In the Yangsheng Ju, the Primacy of Nurturing Life chapter, Cook-Ding says that when he first began cutting up oxen, he did not see anything but oxen. But after 3 years, he couldn't see the whole ox. Now he has so mastered the art that he performs his task in dance-like fashion and does not need to look with his eyes when moving the knife through an ox's joints and spaces. He encounters them with spirit, Shan. He relies on the heavenly patterns, Tianli, strikes in the larger gaps and is guided by the broader hollows. Again, such a passage has led some to interpret the Zhuangzi as advocating a kind of inexplicable mystical access to the natural patterns of the world that enables superlatively effective action. Again, I do not deny that there are textual passages that could easily be taken to support such an interpretation, and this may be one of the genuine voices in play in the text. But this passage can be read on multiple levels of meaning, one of which conveys, often in metaphorical terms, what it feels like to have attained and to perform real-life intuitive skills. Such skills are not, in principle, inexplicable or accessible only to the mystic. Such skills are built from abilities that are cultivated in both the heart, mind, and the body, and intelligent and responsive action is as fully a matter of using one's body as well as thinking. Indeed, I want to argue that we now have better scientific understanding of what happens in the sort of skill activity the text is describing. The cook saying that at the beginning he saw nothing but oxen can be taken to suggest the experience of beginners in a craft, needing to pay attention to what can easily seem to be an overwhelming number of aspects of the skill activity, having to keep all of it in the heart mind at once, and hence having to self-consciously direct oneself in performing them in an exceedingly clumsy way. I take seeing with one's eyes in the apprentice stage as a metaphorical expression for having to self-consciously direct oneself in performing all the prescribed moves. Later stages at which one acquires some skill involve mastery through repetition of the basic moves. We might call them subroutines of the skill activity, so that one can focus one's attention on doing the things that confer excellence on what one is doing. Encountering with spirit conveys the sense of having acquired a feel for what one has to be doing in the moment that does not typically involve thinking about what one is doing, but does involve paying very close attention, intense concentration. In certain kinds of skilled activity, one has the feeling of being totally absorbed in what one is doing phenomenologically. There's no Cartesian pilot in the head directing the body, and not even a unified person distinct from the activity one is performing, but simply the doing that occupies the whole of consciousness. A related feature of skill activities such as cooked things is the embodied nature of the activity. A current trend in cognitive psychology and philosophy of mind has turned on the insight that much of our perception and action in the world is not well understood by conceiving of our brains as information processors that construct representations of the world based on sensory information, and which then formulate plans of action based on these representations. Rather, much perception and action flow from the world, the whole of a person's body interacting with the environment. The philosopher of mind, Sean Gallagher, has written about the way in which embodiment shapes our minds through our body schemas, the sensory motor capacities that give us a sense of our bodies in space. When we close our eyes and raise an arm, our body schemas enable us to know exactly where our arm is located. When we perceive and act, our body schemas become engaged with the environment and with whatever in the environment we can use to help accomplish our task. When we get good at using these very available things as tools, then in effect they become part of our body schemas, at least in that context. The psychologist Louise Barrett gives the example of picking up a pencil and using it to poke something. When we do that, we feel the object we are poking at, not the fingers clutching the pencil and the pencil encountering resistance. The pencil becomes part of our bodily schema. Or to take another example, when one first learns to ride a bicycle, one does not follow an instruction manual one has memorized and represents in one's mind. Just as we learned as young children to stand upright and walk, coordinating our movements with the proprioceptive feel of moving forward and maintaining balance, we learn to coordinate our movements with the proprioceptive feel of our bodies on the bicycle as we move forward and maintain balance. Our subjective experience in such cases of using things in the environment is not of using our minds to direct our bodies in the manipulation of tools, but closer to our unself-conscious actions as embodied creatures, such as poking something with our fingers or walking or running on our feet. The feeling is one of having enhanced bodily selves through our engagement with parts of our environment, making these parts extensions of our bodies. Let us return attention to Cookding's feats of cutting. In terms of what we have come to understand about embodied action in the world, he has made his knife part of his bodily schema in such a way that he cuts in the unself-conscious way one can write with a pencil or pen or ride a bicycle. There is a genuine sense in which, as Cookding intimates, that we perform skillful activity with our qi and not just the part that composes the brain. One need not believe in the metaphysical conception of qi to see that the language of qi is being used to refer to workings of the body, interaction with things in the environment that constitute genuine exploration and responsiveness to these things. The embodied nature of skill activity is also exemplified in the story of the cicada catcher of the 19th Daodejing Grasping Life chapter. His skill in using a pole to catch cicadas is such that he is using the pole as if it were his hand. Moreover, he describes his path to his skill, which lay in learning to balance an increasing number of balls on top of his pole. One might say that he is learning to incorporate the pole into his bodily schema. He does not have to pay attention to how he is holding and manipulating the pole. He can pay full attention to the cicadas. And indeed, when he describes his experience of catching cicadas, he says he is aware of nothing but cicada wings. A feature of the Cook Ding story indicates that his skill activity is not totally an automated process that is unmediated by conscious conceptualization, the goals, methods, and self-consciousness. When Cook Ding comes to a difficult spot in the ox, he says he must pause and gather himself to make careful effort. This moment in the cook's description of his own activity implies that experiential immersion in one's activity is never absolute and total, nor the feeling of flowing effortless. The capability for taking self-conscious control of one's activity gets triggered, perhaps when there is an interruption in the feel of flowing effortlessness. A more complex picture of intuitive activity emerges, one that allows conscious thought, goal-directedness, and being guided by thoughts of method to interact and or alternate with automatic non-conscious doing. Conscious awareness and method seem most crucial at the beginning when one launches oneself into the learning of skilled activity. And it may play a crucial role later when one's automatic skill has reached a plateau that cannot be transcended without thought about how to go on. This point should not be taken to diminish the role of non-conscious activity, however. There seem to be crucial aspects of the activity that are very difficult, if not impossible, for conscious awareness and thoughts of methods to access. One may never be able to fully articulate how one does something skillfully. The wheelwright of the Tian Dao, Heaven's Way chapter, says he cannot pass on to his son the right way to chisel a wheel, and likens his situation to the ancients who left their words and texts, but not what they accomplished and how, knowledge which died with them. The kind of skillful activity performed by Cook Ding is not the sort of thing one can do during all of one's waking hours. It is nested within a matrix of activities that to a greater or lesser degree are guided by one's individual's values, even if those values are subject to change in accordance with the present this. While a skill activity may be worth doing for its own sake, we also ask whether it is consistent with our values. The Zhuangzi's insights into the crucial role of the embodied and non-conscious response are not just limited skill activity that is achieved through training and practice. There are now plausible theories holding that human interaction with the world is necessarily embodied. Consider the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's seminal theory of somatic markers, according to which subjective feeling is constituted by the mental states arising from the neural representation of various changes occurring within the chemical landscape of the body. These somatic changes are responses to a precipitating event or stimulus and may serve the role of making one ready for action. Our interaction with others are among these precipitating events or stimuli and can produce positive or negative affects that get embodied in somatic markers. It is not uncommon that we get positive or negative vibrations from our interactions with particular people without being able to put our mental fingers on what exactly it is about those people that accounts for the vibrations. It may not be the particular content of what's said, but how they say it, or their expressions, or the way they gesture. In the language of early Chinese thought, such interactions impinge on our qi, which record the positive and negative impressions others make on us. There is knowledge of who they are that is embedded in us. waiting to be taken advantage of if we are open to their input. In fact, we humans do have impressive abilities to read one another's nonverbal language of physical postures, gestures, and facial expressions. And this kind of knowledge often sits below the level of conscious awareness and is not recorded in propositions. Participants in one study were able to identify facial expressions they glimpsed for only 5 milliseconds. In another study, participants were able to order 14 photographs of the temporal sequence of an emotion unfolding over the course of less than 1 second. A third study reported that participants were able to detect minute violations of the basic proportions of the human face. They felt something was wrong with the faces, but none of them were able to identify what was wrong. Such skill in nonverbal decoding improves from early childhood through early adulthood. As Matthew Lieberman observes, quote, "The dance of nonverbal communication between people occurs intuitively. And when we get a sense of the other's state of mind as a result of the nonverbal cues the other has presented, we often have nothing other than our intuition to justify our inferences," end quote. We learn complex patterns of motor responses involved in playing musical instruments and driving cars, in which the acquired knowledge is not fully accessible to conscious awareness. And much of the way we learn language, especially the first language, takes place largely outside conscious intent. People tested as having abilities to unconsciously learn patterns of events, such as sequences of a light flashing in different locations on a computer screen, that exceeded their explicit knowledge of these patterns. It is here important to note that when intuitive knowledge or ability is associated with unconscious learning, it can be a matter of degree. Learning certain motor responses involved in skill activities may be largely, or in good part, unconscious learned behavioral disposition. But even here, varying degrees of skillful response may be accompanied and even partially guided by kinesthetic feelings. A pattern of movement can feel just right or awkward and strained. If just right, one knows to continue. And if awkward and strained, one makes adjustments. At other times, the answer to a problem may not directly be a pattern of movement, but something that can be articulated as response to a question. We may have the feeling we know the answer without having detailed conscious access to its information processing antecedents, Price and Norman write. That is, without conscious access to the basis for the answer, even if it is stored in long-term memory. A lot of what is stored in the long-term memory is unconscious and may include learned skills, such as knowing how to drive a car or navigate the internet or reading the emotions of others, or what we read of Kant's second critique in graduate school. Use of what is stored in long-term memory can take the form of activation of behavioral dispositions, or in the form of answers to questions we may not recall the basis for, accompanied by feelings about the rightness of the answers, feelings that the basis is inside somewhere. There's some evidence suggesting that deliberate conscious learning can interfere with a kind of implicit or non-conscious learning under discussion. Thus, the relation between conscious activity, guided by thoughts of method, and intuitive non-conscious activity is complex. Thought focused on method can lead to practice aimed at acquiring skill, so that much of what is initially guided consciously can subsequently become automatic. Conscious thought can also take over when unconscious activity hits problematic spots. But at other times, it can be better to suspend conscious thought in favor of non-conscious processing, because the two can interfere with one another. This returns us to the Zhuangzi point that our names, concepts, and existing likes and dislikes can filter from our experience much of what we could be potentially valuable to us. Our penchant for naming things and pinning them down with our concepts can cut off a more informative receptivity to who or what they are. To appreciate the value of automatic processing, we must distinguish between different kinds of processing. not so relevant to the Zhuangzi point, is the kind of automatic processing that involves the application of so-called heuristic biases that allow us to respond in quick and dirty ways to events and things in the world that are critical to our survival and reproduction. Kahneman and Tversky have been enormously influential in this regard. Much of the psychological work on intuition in their wake draws attention to the extensive influence of heuristically guided processes and the way they can lead us astray. For example, the availability heuristic functions to estimate the probabilities or frequencies of events that fall into a certain class of events E. We are disposed to judge the occurrence rate of events in E on the basis of the ease with which examples of E can be retrieved from memory. Ease of retrieval serves as a proxy for frequency of occurrence because what is frequently encountered can also be easily retrieved. The availability heuristic should provide accurate estimates most of the time or enough of the time to make the disposition to use the heuristic adaptive and selected for during the course of human evolution. Problems arise, however, when ease of retrieval is influenced by other factors, such as the salience of an event that attracts one's attention, bad behavior by celebrities, or its dramatic nature, a plane crash, for example, that would cause one to overestimate frequency of occurrence. These are important ways that automatic processes can lead us into error. But we must also recognize what the Zhuangzi draws our attention to, the possibilities of getting what our words and entrenched conceptual frameworks don't get. Picking up the patterns that reflect the emotions of human facial expressions is a process extended over time, and what it is that's picked up cannot be fully articulated. This kind of automatic processing involves capabilities of picking up on very complex patterns that get revealed after repeated experiences of the relevant sequence of events. Connectionist models of the brain are based on the basic architecture of neural tissues in which each neuron interacts simultaneously with many others and automatically registers complex co-occurrences and interacting regularities. As Eisenman suggests, some of our most useful intuitions are produced not through a simplifying heuristic applied to a thin slice of experience, but non-conscious processing that integrates multiple clues into a meaningful complex pattern that may be, quote, too multidimensional and interwoven for the conscious mind, with its ability to hold a very limited amount of information at the same time, to comprehend, never mind articulate, end quote. This non-conscious processing is holistic and relational in nature. Thus, there is sometimes competition between the automatic processing of experience and explicit deliberate analysis. And if relevant experiential patterns are too complex for conscious analysis, it may make sense, as the Zhuangzi does, to encourage suspension of the latter in favor of the former. This is one way we can place ourselves in a more constructive relationship to our surroundings. Instead of always trying to analyze and regiment the meaning of our experience with names and concepts, we can promote a receptive attitude toward things and other people, waiting for them to teach us and being receptive to what our bodies and non-conscious levels of mind have to say about what we have been taught. I do not believe that these other sources are completely free from conceptualization and bias. Even if accurate as far as they go, they are most likely non-comprehensive. However, they may reveal what our conscious, deliberative heart minds do not capture. Integrating the different pipings from within ourselves. An appreciation for the Zhuangzi critique of the Confucian hierarchy of heart-mind over qi leads us to recognize voices other than the chengxin or complete mind that are also within the self. I have argued that we have reasons from our contemporary study of the mind to heed these voices. Furthermore, I have argued that a more realistic interpretation of the Cook Ding story as a story about real skillful activity indicates that the other voices can alternate with, or indeed be integrated with, a conscious consciously aware heart-mind that is, as shall we say, at least partially completed, but always tentatively so. We must be cautious, furthermore, about the tendency to reify two separate centers within the person body for processing information about the world, as if they were two independent freestanding systems. There is the popular talk about System 1 and System 2 made popular by Kahneman that may serve as a sometimes useful, but at other times misleading abstraction of processes that often involve a mix of characteristics associated with both systems. The abstractions are useful when they are used to highlight competition between the slow and reflective dimensions of processes and the fast automatic dimensions. But they are dangerous if they prevent us from realizing how much reflective thought stands on and is interwoven with automatic processing of information, and how much reflective thought might prompt us to change the conditions under which we automatically process, and how much we might come to adjust those conditions by becoming aware of and critically evaluating the results of that automatic processing. When we evaluate an argument, for instance, why do certain objections occur to us but not others? The salience of certain considerations, as opposed to others, emerges from automatic processes. But what emerges for our consideration from these processes, or what does not emerge, is influenced by our conscious philosophical commitments. The reflective and fast and automatic interweave with each other. Furthermore, I think it is misleading to invariably associate the slow and reflective with the cool and effectively neutral. When I do philosophy, rarely am I effectively neutral. When it is going well, I am excited, hopeful, alarmed, distressed, usually quietly so, but nevertheless. There are ways to deliberately integrate the voices emanating from the person body, suggested by the contemporary study of mind. In discussing the relative roles of intuition and deliberation, Lieberman suggests that people often use a mixed strategy in which they deliberate on the factors relevant to a decision, but then let intuition work on these factors, letting an overall feeling be the decider, or at least getting weightings of each consideration through intuition. As suggested above, there are ways to get at least a rough sense of the reliability of one's intuitions within a given domain of one's experiences. For example, one might be pretty good at reading other people's emotions and intentions in face-to-face conversations, but one might refine one's sense of the scope of accuracy over time and a broader set of experiences. Which persons or kinds of persons one might be better or worse at reading, for example. One might realize that one is not so good at reading emotions and intentions of people who are of an unfamiliar race or ethnicity, for example. Hogarth conceptualizes this kind of gauging of reliability as getting able to distinguish between what he calls kind or wicked environments in which one's intuitions operate. Kind environments are ones in which the information process leads to valid inferences. To quote, for example, when the sample of instances the person has encountered is representative of the environment in which the ensuing intuitive judgment is applied, unquote. While wicked environments are ones in which, quote, samples of experience are not representative and feedback might be missing or distorted, end quote. I earlier distinguished intuitions that come from heuristic biases and intuitions that come from our ability to detect complex patterns on an unconscious level. One problem is that we can't always tell where our intuitions come from. Hogarth suggests that we might put in place circuit breakers, such as think before you do X, to check automatic behaviors that come from heuristic biases that are not reliable for the environment one is currently deciding in. At the same time, Hogarth suggests that we might cultivate greater awareness of our emotions as providing information about the world. He suggests that the conscious, deliberative mind should also seek feedback so that it can discern kind from wicked environments. He also suggests using narratives, analogies, and metaphors that might prompt us to tap into information stored in long-term memory. Patterns we have noticed in the world and stored in memory may help us frame a problem in novel and illuminating manners. Well, this is in great part what my lectures have been about, how metaphors and analogies help us to notice patterns in the world that enable greater understanding and explanation of important problems. And we have come full circle in doing this. Examining metaphors of leadership to be found within the person body, but also in society and the state, has led us to reflect on the use of metaphors and analogies to understand this very process. Clearly, there is a lot to learn about intuitive processes and how they might be integrated with conscious deliberative processing of information from the world. We're just beginning to know ourselves in the interaction with the world. But the promise for better decision-making seems considerable. The hierarchical model of leader and follower seems in need of a great deal of revision. I have not, as it were, overthrown any idea of a leader. The conscious deliberative heart-mind must try to guide the other forces within the person body, but we should now conceive of it not as clearly apart from the other voices. If there is a leader, it is one that has arisen from the ranks and never can be fully separate from those it leads, because it must continue to draw from their urgings and insights into the world. It must maintain a realistic sense of its own fallibility as part of its willingness to learn from those it seeks to lead. The leader must have the strength to be fallible and inviting contribution from those who are led. Going back to the study of surgical teams, the effective teams, as you recall, were led by surgeons who were approachable and inviting of others to contribute, while the ones that did not work together effectively were more autocratic in style, and especially struggled when they felt their authority was being threatened. As Eisenman remarks in her analysis of the difficulties of a diagnosis and judgment in the medical profession, sometimes the path to a better answer is confessing that one doesn't know, or that there are conflicting indications that form a puzzle yet to be solved. This leads us to the application of the Zhuangzi critique of Confucian hierarchy to the state and society, questioning the authority of the wise elite. Just as the conscious mind is perhaps better off listening to other parts of its person body, that is attuned to aspects of the world it has little access to, so we might be well advised to depart from all too common choices of political leaders who fit stereotypes of decisiveness and strength, who project a kind of certainty about what needs to be done that either they do not have when they are being honest with themselves, or that they ought not to have because it is not warranted. As the Daodejing has it in chapter 24, one who stands on tiptoe does not stand firm. One who boasts does not achieve. One who brags doesn't last. In the US, the response to the pandemic was not only crippled by a person whose leadership style is comically, tragically a satire of the pitfalls that Daodejing describes. The medical elite, the experts, faltered in their initial pronouncements that expressed unwarranted confidence in their assessments of the threat that COVID-19 posed. When they began to take the threat more seriously, they either did not properly assess the effectiveness of face masks for preventing or spreading infection, talking about the US here, of course, or they were dishonest with people if their concern was that the woefully inadequate supply of face masks was needed by frontline medical personnel, and hence they tried to dissuade ordinary people from buying and using them, but by denigrating their effectiveness. Fortunately, enough of the medical establishment was scientific enough to change with events and with growing evidence, but they had forfeited some of the trust that people could have put in them by being honest with themselves and others about the newness and unpredictability of the threat. We often are drawn to the decisive type of leader who is definite in their policies and programs. Perhaps we would do better to make room for leaders who are not so quick to say they know what to do, who admit that they have been wrong, or who admit to changing their minds. As Eisenman remarks in her analysis of Jerome Groopman's book, on the difficulties of diagnosis and judgment in the medical profession, as I said, sometimes the path to a better answer is confessing one doesn't know. Such confession might lead to a Zhuangist constructive skepticism that makes one more receptive to something one has not named or conceptualized, but that has been tracked through one's bodily qi. The solution to the puzzle might not come from pressing further and more intensely with conscious analytic thought, but waiting on those quieter parts of the self to process what is too much for the conscious mind to handle. What if we seriously entertain rulers who show strength in their flexibility to adapt to changing circumstance and changing evidence? This seems to me to be the fundamental message of the Daodejing's discourse on Wu Wei. Without acting, it recommends to us, is the willingness to bend to the circumstance, but without breaking. And by breaking, I mean the violation of one's fundamental value commitments. A violation, however, is not the same as unwillingness to change those commitments in the face of evidence one has good reason to change them. For the present circumstances may reveal such reasons. It may reveal new and different sources of value one has not taken into account, but now has reason to take into account. I have included such flexibility as a dimension of accommodation in Lecture 3. Breaking is, by contrast, simply departing from its value commitments to avoid failure. Failure can be a honorable and graceful bending to circumstance. You learn what you can from it and go on from there. So far, I have been drawing from the Daoist texts a conception of the kind of leaders we should be seeking, not those who stand above and over those they lead, but as rooted in the strength of the diverse voices they seek to lead. To close these lectures, however, I need to discuss the institutionalization of Daoist iconoclasm. Institutionalization that incorporates Daoist insights. To write of Daoist institutions may seem an oxymoron, but to conceive of social and political institutions that incorporate the kinds of Daoist insights I've described is not. In an analogy with what we are finding out about the complexity of the mind and body of the individual person, and the ways in which information and insight come from more places than the conscious, reflective, and reasoning mind, and the ways we have just discussed that this mind is less distinct and not all independent of these other places in the person, we need to explore how we could structure state and society to be more open to and utilize information and insight from different communities and individuals who fall outside the circles of elites, the made-up mind of the body politic, who are usually selected to occupy critical institutional roles. Now, among contemporary Confucian theorists, democratic institutions and their compatibility with Confucianism are much discussed. But I propose it's time to discuss how a broader swath of the Chinese philosophical tradition might be brought to bear on fundamental political matters. Again, Daoism might seem very unpromising territory to include in that swath. The most sophisticated Daoist text, the Zhuangzi, is also the one that displays indifference or hostility most of the time to political affairs. The one extended exception is the Yanhui Confucius discussion we have been much discussing, but that exception indicates the potential that could be extended. As Kim Chang has written, moreover, a sense of equality runs throughout the Zhuangzi, based on our equal vulnerability to the fundamental vicissitudes of life. A sense of oneness animating the text also conveys the sense of equal vulnerability. While this sense of common humanity is also present in Confucianism, it is often significantly modified by the valorization of a moral hierarchy. In the Zhuangzi, any sense of hierarchy is countered by the assertion of diverse and plural perspectives, the many ways to select from the pipings. In the fifth, De Chung Fu, Markers of Full Virtuosity chapter, Wang Tai is missing a foot, a marker of having been punished for a crime. But he has as many followers as Confucius himself. His secret is that he accepts the alternations of all things and holds fast to their source. His stillness is like that of still water in which people can see themselves. Only such stillness can still the multitude. Wang Tai's acceptance of what each person has to offer helps to find what they need within themselves. And that is why they, quote, go to him empty and return filled, unquote. Despite offering no instruction when he stands and giving no opinions when sitting. In this passage and in others that follow, there is celebrated a sense of acceptance of all that goes beyond judgment. Later in the chapter, one-footed Shen Tu Jia scolds a fellow student for delighting in his office and pushing others behind him. Many laugh at him for having one foot, but Shen Tu Jia says that in 19 years, he has studied under their master, and not once has he been aware that he was one-footed. Another ex-convict named Tolis Shushan is refused an audience with Confucius. Without attempting to excuse the act that lost him his foot, he tells Confucius that he comes to him with something worth more than a whole foot. Heaven covers all things, earth supports all things. I used to think that you, sir, were just like heaven and earth. I never imagined you would instead say something like this. Can we have institutions that are more receptive and encouraging of the insights from diverse people, just as we could be more receptive to the many voices within our own person bodies? To end these lectures, I shall have to be content with pointing in some possible directions. The first direction is actually a passage in Aristotle's Politics in which he observes the many, even though each is not a good person, may be better when they meet together than the few good, just as a feast to which many contribute is better than a dinner provided out of a single person's expense. Aristotle provides another analogy suggesting that the many might judge better with regard to musical works and those of the poets. The idea is that each individual among the many has a share of excellence and practical wisdom, and when they meet together, they become like a single person who has many feet and hands and senses and multiple capacities of character and intellect. This analogy from Aristotle, in fact, corresponds nicely to the ideas I've been drawing from the Zhuangzi about multiplicity in the individual person. The capacity to take on different perspectives or conceptualizations of the world, as each seems appropriate to the circumstances at the time, and the different voices within the person corresponding to conscious reflection and commitments, but also the non-conscious absorption of patterns in the alternations. The ultimate point of these analogies is epistemic in character. Perhaps there is a way of bringing the many together so as to aggregate their different forms of sensibility, virtue, and practical wisdom, so as to make a better overall decision than the few, even if the few taken individually are much better than the average of the many. There are various ways to implement the wisdom of the many, which fall under the heading of democracy. The ideas I'm about to mention fall outside what has been thought to be the standard form of elected representative democracy, though they may be combined with some electoral representative institutions, or what would be my preference with a meritocratically selected legislative chamber of the type recently suggested by Joseph Chan. As Chan suggests, such a chamber could be selected from ranks of officials and public service people who have shown integrity and competence in their previous service. In the US, the growing sense of disillusionment with electoral representative democracy as a whole is accompanied by the popular sense that representative institutions have been captured by powerful and wealthy elites. The popular sense is well-grounded. Martin Gilens has studied the policy preferences of Americans at different income levels and compares these preferences with the actual decisions of the president and the Congress. In cases where the preferences diverge from those in the top 10% income level, the affluent prevail in getting their preferences enacted. Unsurprisingly, the latter are disproportionately active in the political process and in making campaign donations. Proposals for open democracy present themselves as more in the spirit of a Zhuangzi, who has not turned away from the human world, but engages with it. Openness here means, in the words of Hélène Landemore, one of its primary proponents, that, quote, power flows through the body politic as opposed to stagnates with a few people, end quote. One of the more intriguing ideas for an open democracy is that of an open mini-public, a large all-purpose randomly selected assembly between 150 and 1,000 people or so, gathered for an extended period of time, from at least a few days to a few years, for the purpose of agenda setting and lawmaking of some kind, and connected via crowdsourcing platforms and deliberative forums, including other mini-publics, to the larger population. One strong advantage of such an idea is that it gives ordinary citizens a serious job to do, instead of voting every so often on a very narrow selection of candidates with pre-packaged options to offer. Such a restricted choice encourages too many voters to think of elections as the chance, not to make a good choice based on deliberation, but to affirm one's allegiance to an identity, much like supporting one's favorite sports team. Participation rights in open democracy provide ordinary citizens with agenda-setting power to put a proposal on the agenda of the legislature or a constituency-wide referendum. A striking realization of a deliberative mini-public is the Irish Citizens' Assembly, whose work resulted in the adoption of groundbreaking laws on abortion and marriage equality. Giving citizens a serious job to do means encouraging deliberation that is genuinely inclusive of non-elites, including the Shantujas and Tole-Shushans, who must be allowed to debate with the Confuciuses. Landemore gives, as an example, citizen initiative reviews, which have been a legislatively authorized part of Oregon, the US state Oregon's natural general election since 2010. The CIR gathers a representative cross-section of 24 voters for 5 days of deliberation on a single ballot measure. The process culminates in the citizen panelists writing a citizen statement that the Secretary of State inserts into the official voters pamphlet sent to each registered voter. Finally, I must mention an example from Taiwan. The Taiwan, which invites citizens onto an online space for debate that politicians listen to and take into account when casting their votes. Government would start a new the Taiwan process on a political question it was deliberating, and Taiwanese people from across the full spectrum of opinion would join one another to discuss it online. The Taiwan used a platform called Polis, which, as people expressed their views, gave the most visibility to comments that found consensus. The aim is to, quote, expose points of unity that were previously hidden. That from Audrey Tang. A heated discussion of Uber led to a consensus on the importance of safety, which was addressed in the Diversified Taxi Services Plan in 2016. The Taiwan formed the core of around a dozen pieces of laws and regulations now implemented in Taiwan, from revenge pornography to the regulation of financial technology. So to the conclusion. It is appropriate that I end these lectures with a bow to Taiwan and to my most gracious host, the National Zhuangzi University, and to Kai Marshall in particular, who has stewarded my participation in these lectures. In many ways, Taiwan seems to be rising up to meet the future. And by contrast, I must say, I speak from a country that in many ways is struggling to free itself from its past in order to meet the enormous challenges we face, operating from a model of democracy that in some crucial respects looks increasingly moribund. And I'm rather sadly pessimistic of our ability to change some of its most bothersome features. An overarching theme of these lectures has been the primary mode of human thought that looks for patterns between different domains, between the micro and the macro, and between the past and the future. My argument has been that this mode of thought is far more dynamic, flexible, and creative than is commonly recognized, and that the philosophical tradition of the oldest continuous civilization, China, is one of the primary resources for investigating its past uses, which we have not adequately recognized, but also its potential for use in the future. We had better get to work. Thank you.